afternoon, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. First of all, everyone at Beasley Allen wants to thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to attend this webinar on Paraquat today. I know Leslie and Julia have put a lot of work and effort into this, so we're hoping it's going to be a really great presentation. At the very top, we have a few housekeeping things that we need to address before we introduce our speakers. Beasley Allen's marketing department will handle submitting the CLE credit for those licensed in Alabama and Georgia. And by the end of this week, you will receive an email with an evaluation, a link to this webinar, presentation slides, and a certificate of attendance for those non-Alabama or Georgia attorneys. If you dialed in via phone, please email webinars@beasleyallen.com with your name, bar number, and the number you dialed in from. Please use this Q&A box, or please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen for any questions, and we will save those for the end of the presentation and address as many as we can. And so without further ado, I'll pass it over to Julia and Leslie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Hope you can share your lunch hour with us. My name is Julia Merritt. I am going to be speaking today with my colleague, Leslie LaMacchia. She and I have both been litigating for 18 years. We are both on the Plaintiffs Executive Committee of the Paraquat multi-district litigation. We were appointed by Judge Nancy J. Rosenstengel from the Southern District of Illinois to be on that committee. And so, you know, we have a lot of knowledge to share with you today, and I hope this can be helpful. I also hope this can be interactive. I hope that you will submit questions for us, and we're trying to reserve about 10 minutes at the end to answer questions. If we're unable to get to your questions, email us. You can see on the screen right now, our email addresses are there. And so the purpose of this is to really be helpful to you on your Paraquat cases. So please, ask away. So this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to handle the first half of the presentation, talking about the basics of Paraquat, what it is, what Parkinson's disease is, how they are linked. And then I'm going to send it over to Leslie, and she's going to talk about the epidemiology, the cases, screening, bolstering evidence, the status of this litigation, and what you need to be doing now to prepare for hopefully maybe someday an eventual settlement in this case. All right, so what is Paraquat? What I'd really like for you to do as you listen to this section of the webinar is think about intake. Every fact that I'm sharing with you, I'm hoping will help you decide whether you have a Paraquat case. These cases are really hard to prove, and we screen a lot of cases and immediately learn that it's not Paraquat. So as you're listening to this, think about, is this really Paraquat or is it not? So what Paraquat is a non-selective herbicide. It's highly toxic. It performs the same function basically as Agent Orange. So it's a different chemical structure, but basically it kills everything that it touches. It is used to clear fields. So some of our clients, an example would be they have 100 acres of cattle farm, and a couple of those acres were trees, and they would get a helicopter or a crop dusting service to spray Paraquat all over that section of the field and clear it. It kills everything that it touches, and then they can have more space for grazing their cattle. Another thing that it's used for is no-till farming. It is used to completely clear land. Paraquat is used on railroads. So the back of a railroad car sometimes has a spray car, and it will spray to get about 4 feet on either side of the track. So for right-of-way purposes, easement purposes, visibility at when there's a railroad crossing. It's also used at power substations to clear the land underneath the power lines. So what it's not used for is backyard gardening. If you hear a client calling you and saying, I think, I have Parkinson's disease and I think I used Paraquat on my garden, it's probably not Paraquat. You cannot buy this at Home Depot. You cannot buy it at Lowe's. It is a restricted use herbicide that is for agricultural use only, really. It's also used as a desiccant or defoliant. So, for example, it can be used on cotton that has already been grown, sprayed on the cotton, and then it's easier to pick. It dries it out. Same with tobacco. It is used as a defoliant for tobacco. So it is designed to kill everything that it touches. If you just think logically about any chemical that kills everything it touches, it's also going to kill our, cells and parts of our, in parts of our body. So that's why it's so dangerous. Paraquat was introduced in 1964 in the United States. This is another screening issue. If your client is telling you he used Paraquat from 1958 to 1962, it was not Paraquat. It was manufactured by Syngenta, which is Chinese owned and headquartered in Switzerland. And it was distributed by Chevron until 1986. So the important part about this is thinking about who you're going to sue. So you really need to nail down the dates of exposure. If your client was exposed to Paraquat from 1970 until 1990, that includes Chevron. So you would want to include Chevron as a defendant in the case. However, if your client was exposed in the 90s, then you're not including Chevron because Chevron was no longer a distributor. So just be sure that you sue the right parties when you're drafting the complaint. On the right hand of your screen, you're going to see this is a sample warning label. The warning labels changed over the years. There are many different iterations, but this is the basic. And you will see that skull and crossbones. This is a good way to trigger a memory in your client to see whether they really used Paraquat. Ask them if they remember a skull and crossbones on the label because it's been there. You will see on this label that it says 1 sip can kill. Sadly, Paraquat is used as a suicide agent in some countries. That's a reason why they have taken it off the market because it's so deadly. There is no antidote. But what you will not see on these labels is that it can cause Parkinson's disease. These are the various product names that Paraquat is sold under. So this is another good way to provide recollection, refresh your client's recollection about whether they used Paraquat. A lot of them don't know the name Paraquat, but they remember the name Firestorm. Gramoxone is one of the most common brand names. Leslie is going to talk to you later on about what we send out, our faux subpoena letters to suppliers. And this is a great way to send it to a potential Paraquat supplier and say, did you sell any of these chemicals? Here's the list. So they don't have to look into the ingredients. So Paraquat has been on the rise despite its extreme toxicity. Glyphosate or Roundup has become less effective, and so Paraquat has been used more and more. There are two forms of Paraquat: is a liquid concentrate or a granular solid, and you must mix it with water because it's concentrated. Another way to help your clients know whether this was Paraquat are these elements in the third bullet point. It has a blue dye additive. So if you ask your clients what it looked like, a lot of times they will tell you it looked like antifreeze, kind of that bluish teal, unnatural blue color. The odor is noxious. It is rememberable. You will remember the smell, and the clients will remember the smell because it was so strong. And also a vomiting agent was added to it because of its toxicity. The purpose of this slide is to just kind of show you, first of all, how many years it's been used and how it's increased in use. And secondly, what kind of crops it is used on. In addition to the crops listed here, it's used on peanuts. It is used in citrus orchards. So this is one time when it is sprayed on a living plant. It is sprayed on citrus trees because the citrus bark, the bark of the citrus tree is resistant to paraquat. So farmers will spray the area, the rows in between the citrus trees to get all of the weeds away, to make it easier for pickers to pick the fruit. They're obviously not spraying the fruit itself or the leaves of the tree, but that's another type of use for paraquat, is on citrus. So I like this map for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons is it shows where people were using paraquat, and that helps identify potential clients and existing clients, whether they actually used paraquat. So if you look at this map, for example, look at North Carolina. There's a lot of dark brown on this map, and that's where tobacco is grown. Georgia, which is where I reside, there is a lot of peanut and cotton farms, and you can see, that has a lot of brown in the southern part of Georgia. Over on the West Coast, they call it the food basket, the part of California that has been, paraquat is used a lot in those areas. So another interesting thing about this is showing how many pounds of paraquat per year is being sold in the United States. So the most recent data that we have is from 2019. You will see that $10.5 billion in sales, okay? And we've got 11 million pounds of paraquat is being sold in as of 2017. So the ratio when you mix paraquat is 1/4 cup of paraquat per gallon of water. So, and you think about, they're only using 1/4 cup of paraquat per gallon, and we're selling 11 million pounds of that per year. There is a lot of paraquat usage out there, and that means there are still a lot more clients that are available. We only have across the United States about 4,000 filed cases. That includes a couple of state court cases, the JCC in California, the MDL, 4,000, but there's a lot more paraquat usage out there. All right, so this is just a kind of a mini timeline that I'd like to take you through to talk about what has happened with paraquat over the years and the EPA. So in 1964, paraquat became an EPA registered herbicide. As we know, it was not used in the United States before 1964. In 1972, a law was passed that regulated pesticides to be in two classes: general use or restricted use. And that's important because up until the end of 1977, paraquat itself was a general use herbicide, but starting in 1977 and 1978, it became a restricted use herbicide. So what does that mean? It means that you have to have a license in order to purchase. So you would get, a lot of our clients get their license at the local agricultural extension office or a community college, and you take, a class and learn about it, and then you are licensed to purchase it. So then in 2016, the EPA made a new requirement. Not only do you need to be a certified applicator to purchase it, but you have to be a certified applicator in order to apply it. So previously, before 2016, if you had a crew and you had one person who was licensed with a restricted use license, they could purchase the paraquat and then their team could spray it. After 2016, you actually had to be licensed in order to spray it. And finally, in 2020, the EPA reapproved paraquat. If you think about that chart that I showed you, that map that I showed you a few minutes ago with the $10 billion in sales in 2019, and you think about the defendants that we're talking about here, Syngenta and previously Chevron, you think about the lobbyists and the real reason that this was probably approved by the EPA, because it's highly toxic and should not be sold in the United States anymore. It should be taken off the market. And the EPA's reasoning was feeding America outweighed the potential risks of use. So, which, sounds like a very political reason to continue using Paraquat. Paraquat is banned in many, many countries. Interestingly enough, it is banned in China, where it is manufactured. It is, as you can see in this list, it's banned in a lot of different places, but it's still widely in use in the United States. It's also banned by some corporations, including Dole. So I'm going to shift now and talk about Parkinson's disease, which is the diagnosis at issue in the MDL and in the litigation across the country. So I will tell you on a personal note that my stepdad has Parkinson's disease. He was diagnosed 30 years ago. And so I have a very close personal relationship with the disease. And also, I've become close to a lot of my clients who have Parkinson's disease. The picture on the screen is a very good depiction of what someone with Parkinson's looks like. I can usually spot someone with Parkinson's at the airport or across the room because of the way, first of all, you can see the way that they stand. It's a stooped posture. There is a tremor. The tremor usually starts on one side of the body. It can cross over to the other side of the body, so it becomes on both sides. There is another symptom of Parkinson's disease is called microdermographia, which is it's a progressively smaller handwriting. Leslie's going to talk about the PAQ later in this presentation, but the plaintiff's assessment questionnaire is a document that you have to fill out in order to maintain your case in the MDL. And when our clients handwrite their PAQ and mail it into us, you immediately know that they have Parkinson's disease. Their handwriting is really shaky and it starts large and it gets smaller. Oftentimes, there are a lot of different ways that Parkinson's disease can manifest itself, but oftentimes it does not cause mental decline, but it does freeze your body. And so it's slowly freezing your body, but your mind is oftentimes still completely intact. It is an incurable disease. It is a progressive disease. It gets worse. And there are medications that can help. And also there is some really good physical therapy that can help. I like to tell my clients about the YMCA. So as I mentioned, it freezes your body and it makes everything smaller and slower. So at the YMCA, they have almost everyone that I have found has big and loud are the names of their classes for Parkinson's disease patients to try to make them speak louder because they feel like they're speaking normally, but they sound very quiet. And big is to make those larger steps, make larger motions. That's another symptom of Parkinson's disease is shuffling of the feet. So you kind of have to remind these patients to take bigger steps and speak more loudly. So there are risk factors that exist. However, approximately 90% of all Parkinson's disease cases are triggered by some sort of an environmental factor. Very rarely is it caused by anything else. So an environmental factor can include a head injury. So going back to my stepfather, just to explain one example, he was a cyclist and he was in the MS 150 about 30 years ago, and he fell so hard and cracked his helmet in half. That is what triggered his Parkinson's disease. Paraquat is something that triggers other people's Parkinson's disease. Also, certain heavy metal exposure. If your client welded, that can be a problem. Exposure to manganese, exposure to rotenone, exposure to solvents. So all of these are environmental factors that can trigger the Parkinson's disease to present and manifest itself. So what if you have a case where your client has well-documented paraquat exposure? They're a certified applicator or a licensed applicator. They have a receipt and they tell you they've used paraquat for 40 years. What if they don't have a Parkinson's disease diagnosis? So this is what we do. We send them to a movement disorder specialist, which is a subset of a neurologist. It's a specialist who specializes in movement disorders, as Parkinson's disease is a movement disorder. A lot of these farmers live in agricultural communities without a world-class neurologist nearby. And so many of them have been diagnosed with something other than Parkinson's disease. For example, an essential tremor. Maybe they've been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia. Maybe they've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. There are a lot of misdiagnoses. So you can contact the Michael J. Fox Foundation or the Parkinson's Foundation and find an MDS within 100 miles of your client, hopefully. If there is not an MDS within 100 miles of your client, you can find a neurologist whose practice is largely made up of Parkinson's disease patients. It is a specialty. Not all neurologists know all about Parkinson's disease, so I would really encourage you to find a really good one for your clients. So why is this such a hard disease to diagnose? Well, there is an umbrella of symptoms. It's called the Parkinsonism umbrella. And underneath that umbrella, there are many diseases that present themselves in similar ways. For example, as I mentioned before, Lewy body dementia. So this is an MDL that you need the right diagnosis, okay? So you need a Parkinson's disease diagnosis, not only for the litigation, but also to help your client. If they are being misdiagnosed, they're also being mistreated. So oftentimes, if they go to an MDS, get the Parkinson's diagnosis, then they get on Sinemet, which really helps their tremors. And so, you know, there are a lot of reasons why you need the right diagnosis. So now the link. How is Parkinson's disease associated with paraquat? Well, going back to the EPA, they announced back in 1997 that there was a link between paraquat and Parkinson's disease. There are three main methods of exposure: inhalation, ingestion, and skin absorption. And again, I'm going to talk about this in terms of your intake procedures, okay? So skin absorption is the gold standard for paraquat exposure. It is the one that is linked most closely to Parkinson's disease. The science supports it, the epidemiology supports it. So when you are working with your client, you want to get as much dermal exposure as is accurate and fair. Okay, so did they mix the paraquat? Did they load it? Did they spray it? Were they wearing gloves? Did it ever touch their skin? That is what is really good proof, okay? So let's talk about inhalation. Paraquat is a very heavy chemical. It is made to be heavy. So when it is sprayed, it sinks to the ground, it binds to the plants, it sticks to them, and then after it's activated, it immediately becomes inactive. It kills, and then it becomes inactive. And that's why it's so effective, because once you spray paraquat on your field, you clear the field, and then you can plant. So there's not lasting paraquat in the field for you to plant vegetables in, or plant your crops or whatever. So the reason that this is important is because paraquat is so heavy, it really doesn't drift. And we don't have science to support drift cases. So if your client lived across the field from a farm that sprayed Paraquat, that is not going to be a case that has good causation. I would advise you not to file drift cases. There's just no science. So that's the inhalation. You want your client to be physically touching Paraquat in order to have causation. Obviously, ingestion is another way, but it's so toxic that it can cause acute poisoning and kill you if you ingest it. So there are studies that link Parkinson's disease with pesticides. This is the Tanner study. Leslie is going to discuss it even further when she talks about epidemiology, but I just wanted to point out this sentence. Paraquat increases production of certain oxygen derivatives that may harm cellular structures. This is what I was talking about earlier. If you're spraying something that kills everything that it touches, it's also going to kill your cells. So, but you know, there is research and science to support this. And here is the most offensive part. Syngenta and Chevron have known since 1969 that Paraquat could get into the human brain and cause damage to brain tissue, but they decided not to study it any further. So this is where that dermal exposure comes in. You touch Paraquat, it goes into your bloodstream, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, it gets into your brain, and it never leaves. And the defendants have known that. There are some really powerful documents out there. The knowledge of these defendants is very well documented.
And that's a great segue, Julia, as to what happens, when the Paraquat gets into your bloodstream and ultimately permeates the blood-brain barrier. Either, you've been exposed through dermal absorption, inhalation, or ingestion. Well, your brain cells ultimately get damaged. So how does that Paraquat damage the brain? Well, paradox is known to have a high potential for redox cycling. If you don't know what redox cycling is, let me tell you that it's made up of two words. The RED is reduction, and the OX is oxidation. So oxidation is the increase in the state of oxygen, and the reduction is the decrease in the state of oxygen. So redox cycling ultimately is the disproportionate consumption of oxygen, which reduces the size of the cells and causes oxidative stress, which ultimately damages the cell structure. So I don't want to get too granular about this, but the oxidative stress that causes damage to the cell structures. You can see this graphic here, what a normal cell looks like. And when you add the oxidative stress to that cell, what happens to that cell? It basically dies. If you're more curious about the process of the biological plausibility and the mechanistic features of this, I encourage you to check out the journal article below about the role of oxidative stress in Paraquat-induced dopaminergic cell degeneration by Alison McCormick. Julia briefly showed you a snippet of Tanner 2011. Tanner looked at whether certain pesticides could affect the mechanisms for the development of Parkinson's disease. Tanner has been heavily relied upon our experts in this case. And Tanner found that Parkinson's disease was positively associated with both Paraquat and rotenone. So Paraquat ultimately, there was two mechanisms. Paraquat ultimately impaired the mitochondrial function, that's one, or two, increased the oxidative stress. So this slide that I'm showing you here, and I don't want to get all sciencey on y'all, but our experts have relied on many of these studies here informing their opinions in this case. And to break down Tanner a little bit more, without speaking about odds ratios, you can go to the next slide, Julia. Tanner has been the only epidemiological study that's been deemed high quality by the EPA, and that's due to the odds ratio. The exposure to Paraquat being associated with Parkinson's disease with an odds ratio well over 1. And for all y'all that know and have been involved in mass torts where odds ratios are bread and butter, anything over 1 in the science community means there's an increased occurrence of the event. So Julia touched upon, and we can talk epidemiology, if y'all have any questions later, but I want to get to the exciting part is the case screening. And I know Julia touched upon the intake process, but I want to take y'all a little bit more in depth as to when you're screening these files as they come through the office. So you're looking for anyone who was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and or has Parkinson-like symptoms. Julia, her slide was fantastic that talked about all the symptoms that someone would exhibit if they're Parkinson-like. Do not decline or reject anyone who does not have an official diagnosis of Parkinson's. Like Julia said before, get them to an MDS or a neurologist that specializes with those, or their practice is made up of those with a heavy Parkinson population. When focusing on your client's exposure story, I want you to focus on these following things: whether or not they were an applicator or they worked for an applicator, whether their use was commercial, industrial, or on the railroad. Get to know why they used it. Were they using it to kill all the growth in the fields and they were ready to plant during the seasons? You find that they were using it in the beginning of the spring, more likely than not, and then also at the end. So they would kill in the beginning of the season and then also at the end to get their fields bare. How did they get it? Did they get it from a co-op or a farm supply? Or did they work for a farm owner who then had a license and supplied it to them? The location of the property. This is really important because you need to get specific with the client about the location. Don't just let them tell you that, well, it was north of this town. You want to get them to, pull up a Google map with them online, when you're on the phone with them, find crossroads, like pull out the farm, find things, talk to them, get specific locations, because the more specific you are, the more credible their story is. The acreage of the property. This is important because it helps with the exposure. The more acreage, the more exposure to paraquat. So, and I say this, if it's a very large plot of land, how many times did they remix and reload while applying the paraquat? How many hours were they spent working? The speed of the tractor. The slower the tractor went, the more acreage, the more exposure. So that's really important. As always, get the first and last dates of exposure. If your client was exposed in multiple states, when filing a complaint, be sure to list all the states of exposure. One thing I didn't put on here, but I want to put it on here now because Julia mentioned it, is when you talk to your client about personal protective equipment, if they wore PPE, there's still exposure to their skin. For example, if your client says, well, I wore goggles and I wore a mask, well, their skin is still exposed on their cheeks, on their forehead, potentially their neck, their ears. And also at the end of the day, if they wore gloves, taking off the PPE, they're still touching themselves. So that just bolsters their dermal exposure. So find out from them what PPE they did wear, because even if they did wear it, like they can still have dermal exposure. Other relevant screening tools to take into account, Julia briefly mentioned this, but whether the claimant has been prescribed carbidopa, levodopa. So if they have been prescribed it and they are having a positive response to the medication, meaning their symptoms are greatly reduced, more than likely they have Parkinson's. So I'm talking about if their doctor has not diagnosed them with Parkinson's yet, but has prescribed carbidopa, levodopa, and they're having a positive response, get them to an MDS, because more than likely it is officially Parkinson's with that positive response. If they are not having a positive response to carbidopa, levodopa, it might not be Parkinson's. So you still want to get them to the MDS to either rule in or rule out whether or not it is Parkinson's disease. Another screening tool is if they have been exposed to another chemical such as TCE. JAMA came out with an article on Monday. You may have seen it if you're involved in Camp Lejeune litigation that linked TCE to Parkinson's disease. So we definitely want to know if they've been exposed to TCE in this litigation. Also, family history of Parkinson's disease is another relevant screening tool that we use. It's something that we do want to take into account when litigating their claim. What else do I ask my clients as I go through this process with them? And you'll spend a lot of time talking to them because their story is forever changing, because their memory is not all that great. But the more you talk to them, the more they remember. So I ask them things like, how do you know it was Paraquat? What did it look like? What did it smell like? How did you obtain it? Did you hold a license later on? Like after 1977, they had to go get a license. So did they then go get a license? Did they take any courses through their extension? So ask them how they obtained it. Did they see the skull and crossbones on a label? It's always been on it, unless the label's been ripped off, but you always want to ask them if they saw the skull and crossbones. Did you mix it with water? So they had to mix it with water. They also mixed it with things like 2,4-D, atrazine, sometimes diesel fuel, because it acted as a I can never say this word, I apologize, surfactant. So diesel fuel acts as that. So sometimes they would have mixed it with diesel fuel. Did everything die immediately upon application? So if you have a client calls you and they say, well, I sprayed it on crops and then I picked the crops the next day. And when I say crops, I'm talking like maybe corn, soybeans, alfalfa. And then they went out and they picked it the next day, or tomatoes or berries, whatever. That's not Paraquat. The exception would be hemp, cotton, tobacco. That will dry. Paraquat will make it dry. And then you can go out and pick it the next day. Also ask them, who are your supervisors? Did anyone else see you handle it? So get the names of everyone associated with plaintiff's potential exposure to Paraquat, whether or not they're deceased. Okay. What is required once you get all this information, you put together your complaint, so you file it. What's required once you file the complaint? Well, you have to then get your plaintiff to fill out a 14-page plaintiff assessment questionnaire. It is an in-depth questionnaire that asks about their employment history, their residential history, family history, medical history, their Paraquat exposure, their farming history, what PPE they wore, and also gets them to sign authorizations in order for you to obtain medical records and get employment records in your case. I'll tell you, and if y'all have already had cases filed, you will then get deficiency letters from defendants if you do not provide enough sufficient information. And after you file the case and you've filled out the plaintiff assessment questionnaire and submitted it, you have to go get more evidence to bolster the case. Julie, we can go to the next slide. So bolstering the evidence in their case, you want to be able to get their certified license if they were a licensed applicator. There's a website here that is a great resource for you to try to find their license, either based on their name, the name of the farm, anything like that. You just search on the state. It's a really great resource. It's hit or miss, but it's a really great resource. You also check with the Department of Agriculture. You can submit a request to them to get a copy of their license through their state's Department of Agriculture. You ask them if they have any proof of Paraquat. If they were a self-employed farm owner, do they still have any kind of purchase invoices? These guys keep books and logs and records, and sometimes they have it. So ask them if they have any purchasing invoices. Ask if they still have any photos of the label or the container. With some of your claimants whose exposure might be recent, maybe in the 90s, they still might have things like that. Photos of them spraying, photos of the tractor. I can't tell you the number of photos that we have of those standing next to their tractors that they used to spray and how proud they were, or them in their PPE if they're wearing a coverall suit and they're out in the middle of the orchard, you know, and their daughter swings by and takes a photo of mom out there in the orchard. So we do have photos of them spraying. So anything like that is going to help bolster your case and build credibility. Call the co-ops, see if they remember your client. If they're in a small town and they've been farming for 40 years and they've used the same co-op, call the co-op. They might remember Bob Smith walking in and buying Paraquat. And then if they do remember, go ahead, get an affidavit from that co-op. Talk to any coworkers, witnesses, parents of, I don't want to say parents, I want to say children of maybe the farm owner that might be deceased now, maybe the children, might remember anything about their parents using Paraquat. Affidavits of exposure. This allows your client to actually tell their story outside of the PAQ, which is just a bunch of typed up information. The affidavit's going to allow them to tell their story. Go ahead, obtain employment records to show that they worked at the place where they were exposed to the Paraquat. Then you connect the dots. So you take the employment records, you see that they work there, and then you can request records from the employer, supplier, or distributor, and this is where we attach CMO 10, Case Management Order number 10, and it'll allow you to obtain these records without getting a subpoena. And Beasley Allen, what we've done is we've created a faux subpoena letter. So this letter is an attempt to get proof of Paraquat purchases, orders, invoices from a client's employer's supplier. Again, attaching CMO 10 and also sometimes the list of Paraquat names. Only bellwether cases right now can serve third-party subpoenas. Everyone else, this is what we've been doing. It's been hit or miss, but it's a great tool to try to bolster your evidence in these cases. So the status of the litigation right now in the MDL in the Southern District of Illinois, there's approximately 3,775 cases filed as of last week. Chief Judge Nancy Rosenstengel presiding, and her website, which is here, is wonderful. It's organized with all the court orders. It's a huge resource if you're just getting into this litigation. Currently, there are 4 bellwethers. 2 had recently been dismissed, so we are down to 4 with an anticipated trial date of October 16th of 2023. We are currently in the process of doing all Daubert. Our Daubert motions are due on June 7th, so it's a pretty busy time for plaintiff steering committee at this point. In the JCCP in California, there's 250 active cases. Approximately 100 are pending transfer into the JCCP. JCCP stands for Judicial Coordinated Proceedings. If you're not familiar with that, it's similar to an MDL, but it is in state court. There are currently 2 first round bellwethers, both California plaintiffs, and 4 second round bellwethers. The judge presiding is Charles Treat. He was assigned on January 1st of this year. The previous judge was Judge Weil, Edward Weil. And we've had a couple of status conferences so far in front of Judge Treat. We previously had a June trial setting. Once he was assigned to the bench, he moved the trial setting to June. Then it was moved to October 9th. And then as of last week, on May 10th, he's now moved the trial setting to January 8th of 2024. There are currently state court cases pending in Illinois, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Florida, and Washington. In Florida, right now, there is a January 2024 trial date. Pennsylvania, a little premature, just going through some pretrial proceedings right now. What else should you be doing right now after we've talked about all this? You're filing, you're working up your cases. I would talk to or retain a lien resolution company. Get ahead of this, get in front of this instead of worrying about liens on the back end when settlement nears. And that way you have an understanding of what potential liens your clients might have. Bankruptcy, make sure y'all are doing bankruptcy checks on all these clients now. Probate, if a client has passed away, make sure you get the probate matters handled because you are going to have to file a suggestion of death and a notice of substitution in court for any client that's been deceased. So get the probate matters handled. Client update letters. Y'all, I can't stress enough how important it is to stay in touch with these clients. It's an elderly population. Clients are passing away as this litigation continues. Please send letters every couple months. Provide some confidence to your clients that you're still working on their case. And these cases go on for years. So if you get some letters to them, it means the world. And it also, notifies them you're still working on the case. And that in the event they do pass during litigation, someone's going to find that letter and know that that person has a case and will reach out to you. Affidavits, again, work on affidavits. They're not going to be the be all end all. That's not going to prove your case, but it allows them to tell their story. And And the last thing that I just wanted to share, just because it's really interesting, is some internal documents that were leaked in the Guardian in October of 2022, some pretty damning documents. So we didn't leak them. I just disclaimer, we did not leak them, but they were leaked. And we still have not figured out and found out who leaked the documents. But if you do get a chance to pull up this story and read it, I mean, it is truly it's the documents that we see on a daily basis, not on a daily basis, but we've seen in this litigation. It's a pretty darn good article. So I'd encourage you to read about it, and how bad Paraquat is and what Chevron and Syngenta knew about the association between Paraquat and Parkinson's disease. So I think with that in mind, I think we have reserved enough time for some questions if anyone does have any questions.
And we encourage you, there's a Q&A chat box. Type your questions in and we will do our best to get through all of them.
Yes, and so we do have some questions pending, and so I'll just ask them, and Leslie and Julia, whoever has the answer, just let these people know. The first one we have is, would Lewy body dementia diagnosis disqualify someone from recovery?
You want to take it, Leslie?
So what I can tell you that it's not a case that I would take, and the science doesn't support it. Lewy body dementia is a different diagnosis. It might be under the umbrella, but I don't think we're going to have enough science to support that diagnosis. So I would not take that case.
Okay, thank you. Is having a restricted use license something that you consider for intake? How crucial is that for these cases?
I'll take that one. It is not a requirement. It is a great piece of evidence if a client has a restricted use license. But, a lot of these farmers, they lived in agricultural communities and small towns, and they would get their Paraquat from a neighbor sometimes. And so if we have documentation, get creative with your proof if you do not have a certified applicator or a restricted use license holder, but it is not a requirement.
Okay. So we have a question from Laura Smith. Is there a suggested number of days or months for exposure? She has a client that was exposed for 6 months.
Yeah, I can take that. If you look at the Tanner study, if you were exposed more than 8 lifetime days, the odds ratio was 3.6. Less than 8 lifetime days, the odds ratio was still 2.4. So 6 months exposure is still going to be enough if there's actual exposure, not drift.
Okay. So another one we have. You all mentioned about picking crops the day after spraying. It's probably not Paraquat. Is that because with Paraquat, they would pick the crops right away? So I guess the question is, what does the time period with applying Paraquat deal with when you would pick the crop for vetting purposes?
I'll take this one. So no, the reason that you can't have picked the crops the next day is because the crops would be dead as a doornail. So, nobody with any farming experience would ever spray Paraquat on live crops because it would kill them. So that's how you know it's not Paraquat.
Except for that small subset that you all mentioned, the
tobacco, things that you need to defoliate. Honestly, another one is peanuts. You can spray them on the cracking phase. We've learned about the cracking phase of peanuts. So I've learned a lot about farming in the past couple of years. So.
Okay. So Alex Cortez asked, how are you handling the statutes of limitations on cases that are pending a diagnosis or currently have an essential tremor diagnosis?
Yeah. So, well, first look to make sure that the state is either a no discovery rule state or if you have a discovery rule in place. But in terms of if they're pending a diagnosis or have an essential tremors diagnosis, it's my position that you can still work on getting them. And I hope I answer this, getting them to an MDS, but filing the case as Parkinson-like symptoms and or Parkinson's disease. If they do have an essential tremors diagnosis, I also look to see like who diagnosed them. If it's just your general doctor, and it's essential tremors, getting them to a specialist, you will probably end up with a Parkinson's disease diagnosis, and also ask them what medication they're on. But handling the statute of limitations, file the case, and look to see if they're in a no discovery rule state or a discovery rule state. But I think you should be okay.
And I just want to add to that also, be sure that you're adding in your complaint a fraudulent concealment allegation. I think it's a really good argument. There is an existing website from Syngenta that says Paraquat does not cause Parkinson's disease. So we still have active fraudulent concealment going on right now.
That's right. Thanks, Julia.
Great response. Ken, we have a question from Christopher Williams. Can you explain the difference between a diagnosis of Parkinsonism as opposed to Parkinson's disease?
You want me to take that one? Yeah, so Parkinsonism is a series of symptoms that is it is not yet a Parkinson's disease diagnosis. It could become a Parkinson's disease diagnosis, but it doesn't meet all of those check boxes. Someone with Parkinsonism might not be responsive to Sinemet, the carbidopa-levodopa medication that we talked about earlier. But we are interested still in cases with Parkinsonism symptoms because it could be Parkinson's disease, but they are different.
Okay. Another question we have, do we know what type of stores sold Paraquat prior to the license requirement, and was Paraquat ever sold in a door-to-door fashion?
I don't know if it was ever sold in a door-to-door fashion. I know Syngenta sales representatives have gone to suppliers and distributors and provided the product, maybe to try or in a promotional manner, but I don't know if it was ever sold door to door, like knocking on a residential door. I'd say no. What types of stores sold it prior to the license requirement? I mean, just your agricultural chemical suppliers stores, your co-ops, your farm supply. You're not ever going to find it at Home Depot or Lowe's or Walmart. It was never sold at any of those stores.
Yeah, and interestingly, I had a client from upstate New York who there was just the chemical supply guy who would come to all the farmers. It wasn't a door-to-door residential type of thing, but he would drive around in his truck and sell chemicals to farmers. So that did happen.
Okay, and I think that leads into another great question that we got. How are you all dealing with clients who claim they got their Paraquat from a fellow farmer?
I can take that one. Again, you just have to get creative. First of all, an affidavit from the client is evidence. Okay, so get an affidavit from your client. If the farmer who sold them the Paraquat is alive still, and a lot of these these people sadly are not alive, they farmed in the 70s and 80s, get an affidavit from them as well. Do you still have any existing Paraquat containers in your farm, in the back of your barn? You'd be amazed. These people have old 30-year-old corroding Paraquat containers that still you can see a little bit of a label, get a photograph. So yes, farmers shared Paraquat sometimes. It is true, but you just have to get creative and find a way to prove it.
Okay. So going back to the Parkinsonism, we have a question from Christopher Williams. Are you all filing Parkinsonism's cases?
Yes.
In California and in the MDL, yes, we are.
Yes.
Okay. And that brings up another question. How does an attorney know whether they need to file a case in the MDL or if they need to file in the JCCP in California?
So for this one, if you have a California resident client who was exposed in California, then you file it in California. But you have to meet those two elements. So you can't just have somebody who sprayed in California and now lives in Wyoming. They have to be California residents. California cases are special because California has really good record keeping of where Paraquat was sprayed. And so if you have a California case, I recommend filing it in California. Everywhere else in the country, I recommend filing it in the MDL.
And I want to add on that too. You can also add Wilbur Ellis as a defendant in California because they're tied to California. And Julie was talking about the California record keeping. So California, you're required if you are spraying chemicals to file pesticide use reports. So you're able to get copies of those pesticide use reports. So you can get proof of Paraquat through that.
Okay. Another question we have is, what is the biggest hurdle that you all are seeing for intaking quality cases?
Proof
We
of
can both,
use.
we can split this. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Positive identification of Paraquat is
Yeah.
the hardest, the biggest hurdle. Yeah, it's just, as we've said, it's not sold in regular hardware stores. People don't, a lot of these farmers don't keep receipts from the 70s or the 80s. Who would? It was paid for with checks for banks that are now closed. The co-ops are now out of business. Everyone who worked at the farm is now dead. So proof of use, proof of Paraquat is the hardest part.
Yeah. And again, you got to get creative, use all your resources you possibly can, get affidavits, witness statements, photos, anything that you can to actually bolster that proof of product.
And I'll tell you, we're probably filing less than 10% of the cases that we review.
Mhm.
That's how unusual these cases are. That's how hard they are to prove.
So is it fair to say there's a lot of back work that goes into getting these cases ready for filing and for vetting?
A ton.
Okay. Are you all handling death cases? And if you are, is there any kind of extra evidence that you are looking for these?
Extra evidence. I wouldn't say extra evidence, but I would just make sure that you will be able to actually put together an exposure story for them, right? I wouldn't proceed with a death case or file a death case if you're not going to be able to put together some sort of exposure story or talk to a coworker or witness, or if there's not evidence, I would not file a death case. But if they die during the course of litigation, then of course you've probably done your best and you're trying your best to get evidence of the Paraquat.
Okay. So in mass torts, we've seen this a lot recently. Dual reps is becoming a major concern. And so what are y'all doing to address that dual rep kind of situation? Is there anything preventative that y'all are working on?
I'll take this one. Well, I think the best way to prevent dual reps is to have really good relationships and communication with your client. Stay in front of them, have them know your first name. That's number one. But dual reps happen, and just that's part of the mass tort world, and we just have to communicate with our other counsel and be open with them.
Okay. I think we have one last question. What are damages like for these kinds of cases?
Yeah. So damages, I mean, ultimately these clients, the disease is going to progress where they're going to need lifetime care. So damages that will be calculated will be, with a life care planner, obviously. There's therapy, occupational therapy, things like that. So I think the damages, they're different than your typical mass tort, like diagnosis of maybe cancer case, just because this disease is so progressive and it takes a toll on them and their family. So I would say the damages in these cases are pretty high. Julia, anything to add on that?
I agree. I just wanted to say about a life care planner. I've had a couple of attorneys contact me and ask if they should be retaining life care planners, and I do not think you need to at this point. No, let the MDL work itself out a little bit, and we'll figure out damages after that.
That's right, because the life care plan for someone and the damage model for someone who is diagnosed with Parkinson's at 60 is going to be different than someone who is diagnosed at 80.
So I think we are just about out of time. I want to thank Leslie and Julia for putting on this amazing presentation. And if we did not get to your question, just remember that feel free to email either Julia or Leslie, and they will get back to you with an answer and do all they can to help you. Just another reminder, our Beasley Allen's marketing department will handle submitting CLE credits for those licensed in both Alabama and Georgia. And by the end of this week, you will receive an email with an evaluation, a link to this webinar, presentation slides, and a certificate of attendance for those who are not Alabama or Georgia attorneys. If you dialed in via phone, please email webinars@beasleyallen.com with your name, bar number, and the number you dialed in from. Our next live webinar is June 21st, and the topic is acetaminophen litigation update. You can register for this upcoming webinar or find our on-demand webinars on our website at beasleyallen.com/events.
Last thing, Matt, can you throw up the slide with our email addresses? So if they have any questions.
I've tried, but I can't. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well,
super easy for our emails. It's just first name, last name at beasleyallen.com. So julia.merritt@beasleyallen.com. And please feel free to reach out with any questions. And once again, thank you all so much for taking time out of your schedule to attend this webinar. We really do appreciate it.
thanks. Bye,
Thank
all.
you.